Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Kate Scott toko inua, ko iwi nai tahu, ko kaukuru rarata te runanga. My name's Kate Scott. I'm a 2018 Nuffield scholar, and today I'm going to give you some oversights into my research and reports that came out of the work that I've done. In 2018, I embarked on my Nuffield journey to look at ways to enable better environmental outcomes in agriculture. My interest in this topic was driven by my experience as an RMA practitioner, working largely within the primary sector and the constant pressures faced by farmers to meet increasing environmental regulation. In this short presentation, I will give an overview of my research and the recommendations which came out of this, as well as touching briefly on what has changed since completing my report and what this means for the future of New Zealand primary sector. The starting point for my research was to identify the core pressures on global agriculture. I quantified the top 8 pressures on agriculture as being increasing global population, changing consumer preference, increasing public scrutiny and social licence, global financial volatility, increasing urbanisation, climate change, decreasing biodiversity, and decreasing water quality and quantity. Interestingly, the issues I identified in a range of different countries were largely the same, but I observed the order of importance as being different depending on which country or region you're in. For example, throughout Europe, climate change is probably the #1 concern, whereas here in New Zealand, I found water quality was the most prominent issue. I observed through my travels that globally, New Zealand agriculture is doing well in terms of understanding the impacts of its activities on the environment, but also in its recognition of the need to change our approach to agriculture to ensure a more sustainable approach. This doesn't mean we've achieved all that is needed in terms of reducing the impacts of agriculture, but compared to many other intensive agricultural nations, we have at least started along the path towards finding solutions to reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture. Before applying the learnings of my research, I set about quantifying what the current barriers and challenges to the New Zealand primary sector might be, and how these are limiting the shift towards more sustainable agricultural systems, and therefore better environmental outcomes. The key barriers I identified were, firstly, we don't have a clear plan of where we are going as an industry. What is our long-term strategic plan for agriculture? I found very few examples of such plans at a country level, with the best example being the Irish Foodwise strategy, from which Origin Green is born. The second challenge was that we need to move from working in silos. All of our organisations and industry groups are doing great work, but are often doing this in isolation. The third challenge, how do we move from values-based decision making, especially within the agricultural and environmental policy space, to a more evidence-based approach? Can we ensure more agility to adapt as evidence and science changes? The fourth barrier is the barrier to technology. Technology is a tool that will provide opportunity to overcome environmental challenges, but how do we remove these barriers to uptake and implementation? And how do we focus on technology as a tool for environmental management in agriculture, not just a precision ag tool? The fifth challenge, in my view, was that our policy approach is currently underpinned by heavy regulation and rules, which disincentivises innovation and change. How can we shift to a more enabling policy framework, accepting, however, that rules and regulation will be needed for laggers? I'll touch on shortly what, if anything, has changed in respect to these barriers and challenges since I completed my Nuffield. My findings led to 4 key recommendations which I believe will enable transformational change within the primary sector. My first recommendation is that we need to facilitate and enable robust conversation and engagement. Only through open-minded conversations can we expect to create engagement and understanding. We need to find a mechanism to discuss the difficult issues facing the primary sector in a way which creates understanding without the need for wholesale agreement. A successful example of this type of approach is the Irish Citizens' Assembly model. My second recommendation is that we need to create a national strategy for sustainable agriculture. Success for the primary sector will only come from the creation of an overarching strategy for sustainable agriculture, provided it can achieve wholesale buy-in. An aspirational yet achievable goal will be fundamental. Imagine a world where New Zealand is the most sustainable food producer in the world, and we can prove it. My third recommendation relates to the need to support collaborative science, technology and data. Better environmental outcomes need to be supported by collaboration and targeted science that supports sustainability. We must also enable the uptake of technology and data within the primary sector to support our shift to sustainability, both in terms of practice change, but also to demonstrate achievement of sustainability. My final recommendation relates to the need to redesign our policy approach. Our policy needs to be enabling rather than reactionary. The biggest gains on the path to sustainability will come from a holistic approach which enables ground-up implementation rather than top-down regulation. This concept is best described by the holistic tree. If we think of New Zealand agriculture as a tree and the branches represent all the values of sustainability, environmental, economic, social, cultural and science, etc., our tree can only thrive and bear fruit when we look after the tree from the ground up. That means looking after the soils, the water and the people. Our tree cannot thrive when we keep piling things on top of its branches, and the same is true for regulation. Piling regulation on top of a sector will not help it to prosper. So what has changed in terms of the current barriers to New Zealand agriculture and it being able to achieve better environmental outcomes? And what action has been taken in terms of the recommendations outlined in my Nuffield report? The barriers I identified still, in my view, largely remain, albeit there seems to be a shifting view on the need for a new approach to agriculture, which is gaining momentum, especially over the past 12 months or so. We've also had COVID-19, and the global turmoil created from this is perhaps an impetus for change. In terms of my recommendations, there is still much work to be done to progress these, although there is now focus on this from a broader range of groups and sectors. For example, the Auckland University Koitu report, which was co-authored by Sir Peter Gluckman and Dr. Anne Bardsley, on the future of food in the primary sector, which calls for similar recommendations to those I have identified. We've had the Primary Sector Council vision, Fit for a Better World, which was launched late last year. In my view, this is a great start that now needs to be taken to that next step to become a transformational overarching strategy for the primary sector. The wheels of change are in motion in respect to this recommendation, but how do we keep this front and centre? In terms of our policy approach, there has been no discernible shift in the way that we approach policy since completing my report. The primary sector continues to face increasing regulation and a top-down mentality rather than a ground-up approach, albeit recently there seems to be an increased emphasis on the provision of extension services alongside the regulatory response. My final message is that the New Zealand primary sector is brimming with opportunity, and through collaboration, clear direction through common goals, specific and targeted research and a ground-up approach to change, the New Zealand primary sector can be the most sustainable food producer in the world. Ngā mihi nui, thank you for taking the time to listen, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Kia ora.